Well, I'm Robert Manne, and my pleasure today to be talking to Martin Krygier. Well, Martin, it's great to be able to chat.
It is.
Formally on this occasion. And the subject is not so much the war on terror, but the domestic and legal implications and social implications for us of the war on terror.
And what we do about it.
And what we do about it. And the beginning point, and perhaps you could say a little bit about this, although I think it's clear. Your view is that it was absolutely inevitable that governments, particularly governments that were involved as closely as Australia was in the military operations following September 11, would be under public pressure to do things. That the idea that the status quo was possible is a dream.
I think that's true. I think for two reasons. One, because Australia really had no terror legislation before. It had criminal legislation. And so when people were nervous and governments looked around, there was an obvious vacuum to fill. And then also the sense of, it must be a terrible, trying just to empathise with people in that position. It must be a very worrying thing to run a government and think this is a very open country, allied with a country in a war which is serious and which is dictated by the logic of surprise.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it was inevitable.
So the real question is not whether things were going to happen in the area of law and policing, but whether what was going to be done was effective and just. And is that?
Well, yeah, those two things, and those two things, as we've seen, are said by a lot of proponents of counter-terrorism strategy, not always to go in the same direction. I think that can be overdone, but in principle, it's not always going to be the case that the nicest solution is the best, most effective solution, and that leads to a lot of dilemmas. But yes, I think that there was no escaping that something would be done. And then the question, and it's a whole range of questions, is how do we make sense of what are right ways or what are wrong ways of doing it?
And really, and you begin in a way that not everyone would begin, by talking about words. And you say words are weapons, and that it matters a lot in a way that I think is not normally acknowledged. It matters a lot as to which words you use as you begin to plan for the kinds of things you want to do. Again, why do words matter so much in this area?
I think actually the words are as much, as it turned out, that wasn't my intention initially, the subject of what I want to say as what we do, because the words frame what people will contemplate. If you think that we're engaged in a war domestically, then we know what war conjures up. There are certain things people do in war that they don't do in peacetime. If you think it's an act of criminality that should be invoked, in response to which we need to invoke the police, then you've got another range of views on it. If you think, because this is another of the words I talk about, that sure, there are tensions between considerations of effectiveness and an ideal, just situation where you had no threats, then the language of balance suggests your reasonableness in dealing with this. And in a way, the words you use discard a whole range of other things that might be thought, not simply said, but thought about what's the appropriate way of responding to a terrorist threat.
Well, let's take some of the words and think about them. One of the words that you think is right, and a good word, it's with your normal irony, the way you put it, a good word is terror.
Yes.
And that because terror is very much what it is that we're confronted with. So the obvious question is, why is terror a word honed for the purpose?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, obviously it can be used because it's a frightening word, by definition, be used for other purposes, but I think that it is exactly the right word, because the point of September the 11th was not simply to kill 3,000 people and to destroy some buildings. It was to terrorise a population, most of whom, not most, 99.99% of whom were completely untouched in any physical way. And even, as one author has put it, even if there had been a September the 11th on every day of the year, still the vast majority of Americans would not have been physically injured. But to push that point too far is to miss the essence of the business of terror, which is to spread this fear, to dissolve the sorts of links and reliabilities that people live off in a civilized society. So I think that terror is what it's about, in a way that if you fight a war, it's terrifying, obviously, for soldiers, and it's probably not a happy position for anybody who's involved, but terror is not just about winning over a bunch of soldiers, occupying a territory, defeating a government. It is about disorienting a population through terrifying them.
Yes. So terror is a good word, but you think the combination of terror and war, not so good. Yeah. And the phrase, as you acknowledge in the chapter, you're not the first person to point this out, the phrase, a war on terror, which is the one we're stuck with, has, I think you think, done considerable harm in confusing all sorts of issues.
I didn't always think that. My first emotional reactions to September the 11th were that this is war. And I know why I thought that. It certainly was a warlike act. I don't think that you can easily box terrorism as just a criminal problem, partly because criminals are engaged usually in micro activities. If they kill somebody, it's that person they want to kill. Whereas terrorists, like people at war, are involved in macro activities, where what you're doing is supposed to have ripple effects larger than the people to whom you've actually done it. Nevertheless, I'm now, and have long now been persuaded, that a lot of the wrong sort of allowances get smuggled in as plausible, reasonable ways of acting in counter-terrorist operations. If your one frame for what you're involved in is war. Everybody knows war has casualties, collateral damage, all sorts of things, which we're far more reluctant to allow to happen with a kind of shrug, well, this is a serious business, if we talk about criminal operations and anti-criminal operations, which are also serious businesses. And again, I use quite a lot in this piece some thoughts of an American political scientist, Stephen Holmes, who says that in war, we worry less about false positives than we do about false negatives. That is,
you'll have to explain this.
Yes, sure. A false positive is somebody innocent was bagged by our procedures. A false negative, somebody guilty was missed by our procedures. Criminal law is, and has over generations, centuries, been institutionalized as a way of going after criminals, but doing it under very often serious constraints to protect people who aren't criminals from being bagged, the presumption of innocence. That's something we bring to the facts. I mean, often it's counterintuitive to presume innocence. The fact that a criminal's former character is not going to be led against him unless he says, I was a great guy. Yes. That's all this stuff, which is deep in the institution, legal institutions, was there for a reason, not because these were idealists who never mixed in the world, but because even though criminal law is also after catching bad men, or bad women, or people who've done bad things, to be more politically correct, it's thought that the risks, particularly the risks to one's citizens, are so high unless one builds in restraints that one...
I mean, would you say with the criminal law, the emphasis is almost not punishing the innocent than making sure that the guilty pay? Is that the idea that...
No, I think there's always... It's a tension, a bit like a tension I talk in the paper. Some people talk about two models within policing, of a crime control model and what in America is called a due process model, what we might call a civil rights model. And there are a lot of police who say, look, our job is to catch crooks.
And a lot of citizens
say that too, and a lot of lawyers say, okay, but you've got to make sure that it's crooks that you catch, and the law has, in a sophisticated legal system, not in every legal system, in a humane, civilised legal system, has put in a lot of not namby-pamby defences, but reasons why you've got to surmount certain hurdles. For example, I mean, in criminal law, but not in all of our anti-terrorist law, you've got to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. There's a lot of confusion about what that means, but you've got to persuade a jury that this is very, very strong in this case. Now, you can't say that when you're somewhere in the field and people are sniping at you, and what are you going to do?
And this is so the law, the way in which you'll deal with a crime and the habit of mind you'll have when you're at war are very different things.
Yes, absolutely. And probably for salutary reasons. War doesn't give you very much time for this kind of stuff, and the consequences of loss are terrible. Well, the consequences of loss or of a terrorist act are also terrible, which makes these questions fraught. I don't think it's a simple cut or dried thing. Terrorism is different from most criminal activities. Its ambitions are larger. The notion of ripple effects is built into it, as I've tried to say. So it isn't a simple criminal act. It's not like robbing a bank just to get rich, though you might rob a bank.
So then your position is really that we sort of inhabit a territory somewhere between crime and war, and that we have to think about it in that way. Is that right? It is.
And think about it that way, and it may be that the answer is not easy, but one thing that should be easy is we shouldn't use the word lightly, the word war, lightly, given the risks to citizens that accompany treating prosecution of some among your citizens as though they were soldiers in an opposing army. It's more that I don't think it's a cut or dried matter whether war gets closer or criminal. And there's certain things, for example, September 11th, which are different from other things that a terrorist might do from within a country. But I think a message is if you treat lightly that choice, then a lot of things follow from it about how you frame what is appropriate response afterwards.
And I think another thing you say, which I agreed with, is that if you treat it flatly as war, the war on terror, and if the war is against a method rather than an organisation, you'll never know when it ends. That it would be very hard to say that we have defeated terror, because it has a long history, and I think it has, unfortunately, a long future.
I think that's true, and also true and goes along with that is that one of the reasons people talk so much about a war on terror is for executives to demand and for people to feel that it's appropriate that they have what are called emergency powers. An emergency, if the word means anything, means it's an emergency. It's an indefinite emergency is something different. And if, as we're also told often by people who talk about the war on terror, it's of infinite or at least indefinite duration, then what we're being asked to authorise is emergency powers of indefinite or infinite duration. And I think that's a very
the state of permanent emergency.
Yeah. And a state of permanent emergency is not what we had when we had a real war with the Soviet Union and with communist powers generally. And that was a war. I think people forget too quickly how much power was invested in that war, how many decisions were all around that war. That was a real war which went on for 50 years. If we had then, for the whole of that period, thought of this as being the justification for emergency powers, then I think we would have lost something.
Yes. Now, one of the things that I most liked about the chapter is that it seems to me to avoid the two kind of ideal types in the argument. And a word I actually haven't heard before, but I'll use it now, the view of the securitator.
I invented that word.
And we'll use that word if you don't mind. Yeah. Those people that give priority to the question of I suppose there's something novel that's happened and there's a new kind of threat and we need to mobilise towards it. John Howard and George Bush. And on the other hand, civil libertarians that's a word you didn't invent, who think that the reaction to September 11 domestically has been a disaster in the area of what they most care about, the civil liberties of citizens. And what I most liked about the chapter is your, as it were, finding a passage between the view of the securitator and the civil libertarian. But I want to push you a little bit on this. Implicitly, you're critical of both perspectives. Can you say, first of all, the more unpopular thing maybe in this context, the criticism you'd have of civil libertarians in the way they've responded to what the state in Australia, Britain, America and elsewhere have done?
It's got a number of parts, and so not everybody would fit each of these parts. Sometimes, and particularly at the beginning, my gut reaction was there are a lot of people who don't think that anything serious is happening. I thought this is serious, and I thought that was deeply wrong. And because the government or because George Bush is against terrorism, really this is a beat-up, that the fear is all being fomented by the securitators. There is really no terribly good reason to have that fear. I think there are real reasons for fear. And so I'm suspicious. That may be just a psychological portrait, which may or may not be true, but that's what I felt about a lot of them. Secondly, I think that there is a tendency which goes with that, which we have commonly no, in principle or a priori reason to believe, to assume that people who are accused are therefore innocent. There was a lot of that with David Hicks. I don't know what he was innocent or guilty of, but I don't think that was the main issue here. And in an odd way, I've come to think that in a country like Australia, which has very strongly cemented civil liberties generally, if you wanted to be purely consequentialist about it, say, well, how much difference is it going to make to the average life of most Australians? The answer is their civil liberties. I think not much. It is going to make difference, that is, a weakening of criminal restraints is going to make a difference to people who are picked up on flimsy or inadequate evidence. It is going to make a difference to them. That's important. But what I think is left out of the debate by both sides is that there is something else at stake than the liberties of the particular people picked up or the chances of picking up a terrorist. This is, of course, the concern of the securitators, and that is the integrity of the institutions which make available to us the sort of society which both sides claim to appreciate. And I think that a lot of the worst damage of both some of the reforms to counter-terrorism law here and much more dramatically in the United States, and of the language, which is another reason I talk so much about that, in which we allow ourselves to justify for emergency, for etc., erosion of civil liberties, has less to do with what's going to happen to us. This is not a police state or anywhere near one, and you can see already that even when some organisation like ASIO behaves in what appears to be at the very least an unrestrained and shoddy way, that they come to be very quickly surprised by how much legal footwork they've got to learn now, because there's all that stuff there. But I think that the kind of boastful or sanctimonious defence of harsh measures is not just of harsher than normal measures or of reducing constraints on criminal prosecutions, is condemnable, is unfortunate, less because of the particular individuals who may or may not be caught, but what it will do is doing to the way we talk, the way we think about what the law, the limits of what you can do legally. It's not because we're all sweet guys. People involved in catching criminals are usually tough, and they know that they're up against something tough, typically. And the criminal law knows that too. But to use a distinction I don't use in the article, but a guy who's influenced me a lot does use, there's a distinction between values and purposes. If there are values that really matter to you, very often you'll embed them in institutions, even though it's going to frustrate the people who want to get results in those institutions. That's why we have the separation of powers. That's why we have all sorts of stuff that's built into institutions, not because it makes things more streamlined. On the contrary, sometimes it makes them deliberately less streamlined because you want to preserve certain values, that is, restraint of power. When a securitator comes around and says, my immediate purposes, which ultimately I'll justify in terms of some values, but my immediate purposes are to stop another September 11th, and that should really trump any countervailing consideration, then I hear dangerous words.
Yes. One of the criticisms of the securitators that I was very taken with, and it's a very complex bit of discussion you go into, is that John Howard all the time said we have to balance liberty and security, and and of course he, as an axiom, he thought he'd got the balance right. And what you do then, if I can use the term, is to deconstruct the problems with thinking that it's easy to even to think about a balance between security and liberty, let alone to get the balance right.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think I've come to think it's such a beguiling language, and of course Mr. Howard used to use it almost every day about a different field. He did the balance sheet of Australian history. He balanced on climate change. He got the balance right.
Yeah. No, he was actually a very skilled balancer.
Well, balancing was the language. He never showed us the sums,
No.
and that's an important thing to ask about. But I've come, and people with whom I don't disagree, it's not only the people I disagree with on where the balance comes out use that language, but it is a very convenient language for people who want to come to one position but understand that there is disquiet about the position that they're, by doing that, undermining. They say, well, we understand that there are countervailing considerations, we have to balance them, this is serious, and in these circumstances, this is not normal times, got all these threats, the balance comes out here. I think that if you ask about the language, the only thing saying you've got a balance here does is to give some spurious pretense that you've done some deliberation.
Yeah.
Because balance adds nothing to saying we've got hard choices here. Now, when you say you've got hard choices, you've still got to justify why you make the particular choice you make. When you say that you've got a balance and this one really outbalances, it's as though you don't have to make that justification. But if you think for a second about it, if you take the metaphor seriously, if we've got a balance, it's because we've got some currency. Either weight is the currency, so an apple and an orange can be balanced, but only in those terms, or the value is the currency. We've got money or something like that. But we don't have anything like that with security and liberty. We have a bunch of measures which are proposed by securitators. Very often they're what is particular fashion or a response to the particular threat which has been exposed by the last bombing or financial transaction or whatever. A hole is exposed, and you say, well, we've got to do something about that hole. And so a range of measures come in response to that. Very often they have a kind of international pedigree, whether or not they work. There's a lot of work on that. That there will be an efflorescence of a certain sort of measuring in response to a certain outrage. That's what you've got on one side. On the other side, you've got, well, what do? We catch people sometimes. We can take preventative detention even though they haven't done anything, or we can put control orders on people who are not even accused of having done anything, or various other measures that might be proposed. Or ASIO can have powers of investigation that it once didn't have, and with them detention. Now here you've got a range of discrete measures, some which you hope are going to help security, and others which you know are going to damage the security too, the liberty and security of the people. How do you balance? You don't balance. You have to make moral choices and prudential choices and political choices, and you should, if you think that your choices are so well justified, be upfront and say, look, these arguments are so compelling that we really have to make this choice.